Darren Wilson recently had an interview with The New Yorker. It was the first extensive interview after the Michael Brown shooting case, and Jake Halpern did an excellent job interviewing Wilson and kind of getting a sense of his hypocrisy when it comes to cultural issues, specifically white culture versus black culture. Now, for anyone who thinks that Darren Wilson doesn't have a racist bone in his body, you should absolutely read this piece because it kind of clarifies exactly who Wilson is based on what he says on his own, okay? This is not a summary of what he says. This is not paraphrasing. These are quotes that he provided to The New Yorker. So it's a long piece. We can't get to every single detail in it, but I do want to highlight some of the more important portions of it. So according to The New Yorker, he talks a little bit about black culture versus white culture and how black kids are not raised as appropriately as white kids. Okay, now he doesn't say it in so many words, but he implies it. I'll give you one example. He talks about one blind black woman who was being taken advantage of by her children. Okay, and here's what he said about it. They ran all over the mom. They didn't respect her. So why would they respect me? They're so wrapped up in a different culture than, what am I trying to say is, the right culture, the better one to pick from. So let's just delve into that a little bit, and I'll give you more from the interview. What do you guys think about that?
You want to go? I mean, I did go at it. I mean, but you go first.
There's a lot of problems with the quotes that Darren Wilson provided in this interview. I mean, I don't think he has a very intelligent grasp of any sort of, like,
anything.
Racial issues in America, and even though this man is a police officer, I think that's what is bothersome, is that he doesn't have a very complex view of racial politics, and he is an authority figure at the center of it, and then of course was involved in the murder of a black suspect, of Michael Brown. So you understand the root of, like, all this police brutality. Like, you kind of understand sort of the systemic foundation. In this article, I know that it seems like, okay, these are just simple quotes, and how can you sort of, like, you know, connect the dots? But to me, I think you're really seeing, like, ground zero.
For me, as I was reading that piece, I noticed this us versus them mentality throughout. And his unwillingness to understand that his own upbringing was questionable, right? Like, if a black child experienced his upbringing, he would argue that, oh, it's just typical of black culture, right? I'm going to get into his upbringing in just a second. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about. But when it comes to black families and maybe some of the strife that they have to deal with, you know, he has this very us versus them mentality. Like, you know, white people wouldn't do this, but black people, it's to be expected. And that was what was implied throughout the piece, and that's what made me so uncomfortable.
It's so simplified, and that's why it's so scary.
Yes.
I mean, it always shocks me when anyone is surprised when they think or hear that he's a racist. I mean, first of all, in this, he frames an entire culture as one thing, thugs, you know, whatever, uncommon, the lesser than. So I'm not surprised or shocked by this. And also, there's a greater issue here that I'm not going to really get into, but we live in America. This is the most racist, homophobic, sexist country, and this is not exclusive to us. I love America, but let's be honest, the systemic problems that we have never been addressed. It's as if we just hope that every generation will die out and then, you know, we'll get better because, of course, they've died, but we don't forget that these views and beliefs are still getting passed on. And even though there's a few liberal and we work together to change things, and things are getting progressively better, when you look at what the world is like for African Americans, for gay people, for women, you have to realize that this doesn't shock me. This is, you know, this is what he is, a representation, unfortunately, of a lot of people, a lot of white people in power.
You know what scares me the most is that he's not a disgusting, blatant racist.
Exactly.
You know,
Not
these
at
are
all.
these
It's
are
a little more implicit.
right, and what's scary about that is that, you know, it's one thing when you see someone who is a white supremacist who goes off and does some horribly violent crime, and you're like, this person was crazy. This man isn't crazy. He was inculcated, basically. He was raised in, like, in this social structure that allowed him to see the world in this us versus them way. And what's interesting, if you read the article, and I do think it is dangerous when you just pull out quotes and to just be like, this man's a racist.
Right.
I mean, obviously, when you look at the context of what happened with Michael Brown, it is so fraught, right, with emotions and like, I mean, even just the moral complications of, like, the federal report on what goes on in Ferguson says this, but then he was not charged with murder. So, I mean, there's no clean-cut way to look at this. And I just think calling him, just explicitly being like, oh, he's just a racist, in some ways, I mean, also simplifies what's going on.
Yeah, it's not just about Darren Wilson. It's about the police department that he's from. I mean, the Justice Department did its own investigation, not only into Darren Wilson, but into the entire police department that he worked for, and they saw that racism was a serious problem. Discrimination was a serious problem. They were specifically targeting people of color when it came to any type of policing, okay, whether it was handing out citations for traffic violations or going after them for things like drugs, whatever it was. They would turn a blind eye to the white community and focus solely on the black community. So that was a big problem. And, just to buttress off your point about, being in that bubble, that's exactly what Darren Wilson was in. Yeah. This bubble where it was reiterated over and over again that black people are the enemies and those are the people that deserve the policing. So to delve into his upbringing and how incredible it is that he's judgmental about, black families, but isn't very judgmental about his own. He says, do I think he had the best upbringing? No, not at all. So he admits he didn't have the best upbringing. In that Wilson's mother, Tanya Dean, frequently wrote bad checks and stole money to pay back debts, okay? He worried that she would steal what little money he made working summer jobs, so he opened 2 bank accounts. The first, which he had almost no money in it, was a decoy. He put his real earnings in the second secret account. Darren Wilson says himself, you do realize that his parents are suing me, right? Referring to Michael Brown's parents. So I have to think about him. Do I think about who he was as a person? Not really, because it doesn't matter at this point. So let's get to the second part of this in just a second. Let's focus on his upbringing with his mom and how he basically had to lie about his own bank accounts. There was a point where his mom was staying over like a family friend's home, and he had to let them know that they need to be really careful because if there's any opportunity for her to steal their identity and, get involved in fraud, she'll do it. And so my question is, how would Darren Wilson respond to a story about a black family that was dealing with a mother who had a similar problem?
I mean, he would respond in the same way. Because to go on your point of like just blanking and labeling him a racist, there's different levels of racism, structural, internalized, the systemic, and so he clearly has racist views, whether it's against African Americans, whether it's against Latinos, whether in this case it's African Americans. And this is unfortunately the way when you're in that bubble, and unfortunately that bubble spreads across America, you end up viewing and creating these views of people and sort of disassociating your experience from their experience. And that's exactly what he's doing here. If that was the story of the African-American man that he shot, I'm telling you, he would be like, this is a prime example, instead of saying, hey, see, he sees himself as triumphant and as cunning because he was able to figure out how to make it. But he sees this as somebody else who had the same story as, look at that, they're thieves, they're less than.
It's to be expected.
It's to be expected.
That attitude was what really rubbed me the wrong way in his responses to the questions. And again, I think Halpern did a really good job at very subtly pointing to his hypocrisy there, And Halpern, I think, did a great job because he didn't, include his own opinions or his own
slant.
Very
smart.
Right.
Which was very, very smart and also very well done. I think that it's difficult to not have your opinion in the piece, especially when it comes to something as controversial as this.
Well, I do appreciate that we got to see sort of a fuller, more rich version of a human. Like you do get to try to you start to understand this man, and you watch how he isn't empathizing with the victim of his own shooting, and it's so interesting because I started to understand there were parts in the article where you realize he could have taken on this mentor at one point, this man who was really integrated into the black community that he served, this older veteran police officer who had really nuanced views of race and was trying to help Wilson along, and then they sort of kind of parted ways, and you're just like, if that man had had a bigger influence, if he had been able to steer him in the right direction, and if he had been trained properly, because that's one thing the veteran officer brought up is that you go through training and you have, this fact really stuck out to me. A recent survey by the Police Executive Research Forum revealed that cadets usually receive 58 hours of training in firearms, 49 in defensive tactics, 10 in communication skills, and 8 in de-escalation tactics.
That's terrible.
Those numbers say it all.
Say it all.
And so in a way, Darren Wilson was also failed by this police force, by the training and how he was equipped as an officer. I'm not making excuses for him. I'm just trying to look at the broader
There's an issue with the
complexity
system.
of it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I want to leave this story with one final quote from Darren Wilson to kind of sum up what his mentality is, okay? He talks about how difficult it is for him to find a place to eat. And he says, we try to go somewhere, how do I say this correctly, with like-minded individuals, where it's not a mixing pot.
Yeah, that's pretty insufferable.
Yeah. All right. Well,
Welcome to America.